I'm not the kind of guy who holds grudges. I've always kept my head down, worked hard, took care of my dad, minded my own business. But then Karen came along. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was a storm, and by the time she was done with me, I wasn't the same man anymore. This is the story of how one woman's obsession dragged me into a fight I never wanted, and how I learned to hit back. I'm Travis Henderson, a simple guy who spent most of his life working 12-hour shifts at the local repair yard. My dad's health has been getting worse, and I juggle his doctor's appointments along with everything else life throws at me. Not too long ago, I lived in relative peace in a small suburban community that prided itself on its so-called neighborly atmosphere. But there's always a catch. This place had an HOA, or Homeowners Association. And there was Karen. Karen was the kind of person who believed she ruled the entire neighborhood. She had the loudest voice in our monthly HOA meetings. She scolded the local kids for skateboarding too close to her driveway, and she'd send out nasty letters about people's lawns if so much as one weed sprouted. Everyone either avoided her or tried not to piss her off, especially the older folks who were tired of petty confrontations. But I never had much to do with her, until my old friend Carl came to live with me. Carl was my buddy from way back. He was older than me by a dozen years, had a heart of gold, and had fallen on hard times. He lost his house to bankruptcy, so I let him crash in my spare room. The plan was simple. He'd stay until he could get back on his feet, and in return, he helped fix up my house, paint the fences, and do all sorts of projects. Carl was a hoarder, though. He dragged an ungodly amount of old tools, parts, and half-busted machinery into my garage, but still, he was a respectful housemate. At first, Karen had no clue Carl was even around. She was too busy patrolling front yards, making sure everyone's mailbox was at the prescribed height, or forcing neighbors to repaint fences in compliance with the guidelines. I brushed her antics off, content that my place was tidy enough not to be on her radar. But something changed when she noticed Carl's old sedan parked in my driveway. One day I came home after work and found a bright pink notice stuck on my front door. It said I had 24 hours to remove the unsightly vehicle from my driveway. At the bottom, signed in bold letters, was Karen, HOA Enforcement Officer. I couldn't believe it. Carl's sedan was old, but it wasn't a rust bucket. And I had every right to keep a visitor's car on my property. That was the start of the trouble. When I called Karen to ask what the problem was, she launched into a 10-minute tirade about the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. She said Carl's car hurt property values and insisted it be towed if we didn't move it out. I just laughed in disbelief. But I also felt a knot in my stomach, wondering what the next step would be if I ignored her, and that was just the first pink notice. By the week's end, Karen had delivered 3 more official-looking envelopes, claiming we were in violation of Clause 2.1, then Clause 5.3, and on and on. Each letter cited some new imaginary rule from the HOA manual. She tried to fine me $100 for parking infractions, then $200 for improperly maintained driveway. I realized she wasn't going to stop, so I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to face this situation head-on. Little did I know that encounter would set off a chain of events unlike anything I'd experienced before. I remember stepping into the community hall and noticing a crowd of folks in their 60s and 70s hunched over plastic chairs, flipping through thick HOA pamphlets. A few folks waved politely at me, but the moment Karen saw me, she practically pounced. "Travis," she announced in front of everyone, "we need to talk about your property." Her voice dripped with that sweetly condescending tone you hear from someone who thinks they're doing you a favor by publicly humiliating you. I tried to stay calm. "Karen, these notices you keep posting on my door, where exactly in the bylaws does it say my friend can't park his car in my driveway for a few days?" She smirked. "I can show you the exact lines later, but it's common knowledge around here that old or junk vehicles must remain hidden in garages to maintain neighborhood standards." An elderly man, Bob Jenkins, piped up from the front row. "Karen, I don't recall reading that. Are you sure it's in the bylaws?" Karen shot him a glare that could melt paint off a wall. "I'm certain, Bob. I've done my research." I glanced across the room and noticed a few neighbors exchanging sympathetic looks with me. Karen's intimidation factor was legendary, but they all looked too tired or too scared to challenge her. "I've got the HOA manual right here," I said, pulling out a battered binder I'd borrowed from my next-door neighbor. "Why don't we take a look together?" Her face twitched, but she kept her composure. "We'll discuss it after the official meeting. Right now, we have bigger concerns, like next month's neighborhood beautification initiative." Then she turned to the group, effectively dismissing me. After the meeting, I cornered her in the hallway. She tried to slip out, but I wasn't letting her off that easy. "Karen, I want clarity. The way you're citing these rules feels personal. Is there some reason you're targeting my place?" She folded her arms. "Personal? Don't flatter yourself. I'm simply enforcing what everyone else agrees on." "I haven't heard a single neighbor complain," I shot back. "If you're so confident, show me the rule or stop harassing me." That's when she pulled out her phone. "Fine, Travis. Let's have the police settle this. I'm sure they can help me remind you that HOA regulations are legally enforceable. You'll see soon enough." I was stunned. She threatened to call the cops over a parked car? My blood pressure spiked, but I took a deep breath. "Go ahead and call them. I'm not doing anything illegal." Karen stormed off, her heels clicking angrily on the polished floor. I had a sinking feeling that the next time we clashed, it'd be worse. And I was right. Dad's health had taken a turn for the worse, and I'd spent the morning driving him to the cardiologist. I dropped him off at home to rest and headed out to the pharmacy for his prescription. On my way back, I spotted flashing blue lights outside my house. My heart sank. Sure enough, there was a patrol car parked along the curb, and an officer was standing on my front porch with Karen by his side. As soon as I stepped out of my truck, Karen loudly announced, "Officer, that's the homeowner. Make him explain why he's refusing to comply." The officer, an older fellow named Deputy Lang, looked thoroughly unimpressed. "Sir, I was dispatched for a reported disturbance. Your HOA representative here claims you're harassing her and refusing mandatory guidelines." "Harassment? She's the one leaving threatening notices and sneaking around my property," I exclaimed. "Deputy, this is all about a car in my driveway. That's it. She's abusing HOA rules that don't even exist." Karen stiffened. "You lied to me, Travis. You said you'd move that wreck. I had no choice but to involve the authorities." Dad opened the door, looking exhausted. "What's going on, son?" Deputy Lang tipped his hat, a bit sympathetic. "Sir, you should stay inside if you're not feeling well. This won't take long." But Dad slowly walked out, leaning on his cane. "I'll be fine." He looked at Karen. "Why won't you leave my boy alone? He's done nothing wrong." Karen didn't even acknowledge Dad. Instead, she thrust a piece of paper at Deputy Lang. "Officer, read this. It's a letter from our HOA stating the necessary steps for property compliance. Travis is willfully violating them." The deputy scanned the page. "Ma'am, this looks like a set of neighborhood suggestions, not an official statute or city ordinance. The police can't enforce internal HOA guidelines. This is a civil matter." Karen's face turned crimson. "Civil matter, but you have the authority." Lang shook his head. "I can only intervene if there's a crime, like trespassing or property damage. This letter doesn't prove any wrongdoing." Her anger boiled over. "So you're telling me you won't do anything? He's jeopardizing our entire community's look. If property values drop, that's a huge financial concern." Dad cut in, his voice hoarse but firm. "You're risking my health, Karen. Stop this nonsense." Lang raised a placating hand. "Folks, let's calm down. I'd advise you, ma'am, to handle this through your HOA's legal channels. I'm heading back to my cruiser now." Karen turned on her heel and marched off, shouting over her shoulder, "You'll regret this, Travis. I promise you haven't heard the last of me." Dad was shaking, furious at the stress she'd caused. I led him back inside, my own heart pounding. The woman had gone so far as to call the police on me, over a car. I knew then. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a threat, and I had a feeling she was about to up the ante in a big way. Amid all the HOA drama, Carl's health quietly deteriorated. I'd known he wasn't in great shape. He was on disability and had some chronic issues. One evening, after a fairly laid-back day, I found him collapsed in the living room. The paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Carl was gone at 58 years old. I was in shock. He was my friend, my housemate. We'd been through so much, From the day he lugged boxes of rusty tools into my garage, to the evenings we spent watching old westerns. Now, out of nowhere, I was the one making calls to the coroner and trying to figure out final arrangements. While I was still reeling from his death, the phone rang. A curt voice asked, "Is this Travis? I'm Margot, Carl's daughter. Heard my dad lived with you. He died this morning, right?" The bluntness made my stomach twist. "Yes, I'm very sorry for your loss." She snorted. "Yeah, sure. Look, I need to know if he had life insurance. My brother Todd and I are supposed to be the beneficiaries. There was some separation agreement from Mom." I was speechless at her complete lack of empathy. "Margot, I have no idea. Carl never mentioned an active policy. He could barely afford his bills." That set her off. "He was required by law to maintain a policy. Well, I'm sure you'll understand we need to check his car and personal stuff. He might have hidden documents." Her words stung. They'd ignored Carl for years, and now, just hours after he died, they wanted to rummage through his belongings. I ended the call quickly, my grief morphing into anger. Less than a day later, Margot showed up at my door with Todd. They breezed inside, ignoring my attempts at a greeting, and demanded to see Carl's possessions. They seemed fixated on his car, which was still in my garage, blocked by towering piles of junk. "Where's Dad's vehicle? We're taking it," Todd said, tapping his foot. I squared my shoulders. "Look, I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm not releasing anything until we sort out the legalities. If you want to claim his property, you'll need some documentation." Margot rolled her eyes. "Dad didn't have a will, so we're his next of kin. We own whatever he left behind." "That's not how this works," I replied, voice trembling with mounting frustration. "You can't just show up the day after your father dies and haul his stuff away without any formal process. Besides, the car is stuck behind mountains of his tools. This is going to require professional movers." They erupted in indignation, threatening lawyers, going on about how I was stealing their inheritance. Finally, when it became clear I wasn't backing down, they left, hurling insults as they stomped off my porch. The next day, I discovered they'd conveniently left me out of Carl's funeral arrangements. I had no idea where or when it would be. Grief, anger, and exhaustion weighed me down. And ironically, the HOA battle with Karen still loomed over me like a thundercloud. In the face of constant calls and texts from Margot and Todd demanding Carl's belongings, I devised a plan. Carl's old sedan was parked at the very back of my two-car garage. In front of it, a labyrinth of Carl's hoarded items, broken televisions, ancient computer monitors, toolboxes crammed with random gears, boxes overflowing with steel scraps, and a monstrous metal lathe that must have weighed a ton. I stacked everything as high as possible, forming a literal fortress of junk around that car. Even if they tried to haul it out, they'd need to remove every last piece of hardware first. Deep down, I felt guilty, but their callous attitude hardened me. I wasn't about to make it easy for them, especially when they treated Carl's memory like a lottery ticket. Meanwhile, Karen seized on any chance to escalate things. She noticed the influx of junk in the garage. It wasn't visible from the street, but she'd catch glimpses whenever I opened the garage door. Soon enough, I started receiving more violation notices, this time for unapproved modifications and inappropriate storage practices. She was just itching for a reason to find me into oblivion. I heard from a neighbor that Karen boasted she'd have me begging to leave the HOA. But there was one problem for her. Legally, I was within my rights to store items in my own garage. It wasn't the neatest arrangement, sure, but it wasn't illegal. One afternoon, as I reorganized the junk fortress, I spotted Karen skulking around the side of my house trying to snap photos through the garage windows. She scurried off when she saw me approach. That was it. I decided to consult a lawyer. I booked an appointment with an attorney named Lisa Davis, recommended by a coworker. She specialized in property disputes and HOAs. The moment I walked into her office, I felt relief. She was calm, methodical, and thoroughly unimpressed by HOA bullying tactics. After I laid out the story, Carl's passing, the feuding kids, Karen's harassment, Lisa gave a knowing smile. "I've dealt with people like Karen before. Let's talk strategy." By the time I left, I had a plan to handle both fronts. Margot and Todd's attempt to seize Carl's car without proper legal documentation, and Karen's harassment through alleged HOA bylaw violations. Lisa drafted letters to Margot and Todd's attorney, demanding official proof of ownership transfer for the car. She also prepared a formal response to Karen, asking her to cite specific bylaws and clarifying that any further unauthorized entrance onto my property could be considered trespassing. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had an ally, a professional who wouldn't let me be pushed around. A couple of weeks later, the HOA held another meeting. This time, the subject wasn't random beautification initiatives, it was me. Or, more accurately, it was the ongoing compliance issue at my address. I arrived early, and Lisa came along for support. When we walked into the room, Karen was at the head of the table with a stack of documents in front of her, obviously prepared to put on a show. Several neighbors sat on folding chairs, with a couple more standing against the back wall, curious about the drama. Karen cleared her throat with exaggerated importance. Let's address the matter of Mr. Henderson's property. Specifically his repeated violations, an unmaintained garage, unauthorized vehicle storage, and potential hazards. Lisa leaned in, whispering, "Let's see what she's got." I tried to keep my cool. "Karen, could you cite the exact bylaw or rule you're referencing?" She tapped her papers. "Certainly. Section 3.2 covers the condition of visible property areas. Section 4.6 references unregistered or inoperable vehicles. Section 5.3 addresses—" Lisa politely interrupted. "Could you read the exact text, please?" Karen's lips pursed. "The text says, well, it basically outlines that owners must keep their external property free of clutter and ensure all vehicles are in working order." Lisa nodded. "Yes, but we have photographs showing that Mr. Henderson's vehicle is fine, and the other one belongs to a friend who passed away, which is not in open view." "Whether it's in open view or not, it's still a junk car," Karen snapped. "I'm concerned about rodents, rust, and the impact on property values." A neighbor named Sheila raised her hand timidly. "Karen, that car's been in the garage, hasn't it? How can it impact property values if we can't even see it?" Karen glared. "That's beside the point. The principle stands. Our rules must be followed." Lisa calmly presented a letter. "This is a formal request for you, Karen, or the HOA board, to specify exactly how Travis is in violation. If you cannot do so with explicit references, we consider these notices null and void." Karen seemed rattled, but tried to regroup. "I'm not alone in this. Others in the neighborhood feel the same." She looked around the room for support, but the silence was deafening. A few folks coughed or looked away. Bob Jenkins scratched his head and mumbled, "I don't have a problem with Travis personally. You might be going a bit far." Karen's cheeks turned bright red. "Fine, we'll let our attorneys decide." She banged her gavel, she always loved that gavel, and declared the matter under HOA review. But the seed of doubt had been planted in everyone's mind. Maybe Karen was overreaching. Maybe I wasn't the villain she painted me to be. I walked out with Lisa feeling both relieved and worried. Karen never did well with public humiliation. I braced myself for her next move. While I battled the HOA, Margot and Todd were turning up the heat on their end. They'd hired a lawyer, a loud, aggressive guy named Geary, who started sending me official notices. Geary threatened lawsuits if I didn't immediately release Carl's car and personal belongings. One morning, I received a letter accusing me of unlawful conversion of assets, alleging that by not surrendering Carl's property, I was effectively stealing from Margot and Todd. The letter also hinted that I might have sold the car. That was a low blow. I phoned Lisa in a panic. "They're saying I sold it. That's insane." She sounded unfazed. "Don't worry, we'll respond with evidence that the car is still in your garage. In fact, why don't you take a few pictures of the interior, showing the license plate and the environment around it?" So I did. I opened the garage door just enough to snap pictures of the car's roof half buried behind boxes of rusted chains, old tires, and that hulking metal lathe. It looked like a fortress. The images were comical, but also crystal clear proof I hadn't touched Carl's car. Lisa fired off a letter to Geary with those photos attached. She stated I was happy to release the car upon valid legal documentation and the arrangement of professional movers, as the entire garage load needed safe removal. Meanwhile, I wouldn't be responsible for the cost or the logistic nightmare. That was on them. A week later, A team of movers actually arrived, courtesy of Margot and Todd. Watching them attempt to clear the garage was both heartbreaking and satisfying. Heartbreaking because it was Carl's junk, but satisfying because Margot and Todd had to shell out thousands of dollars to haul it all away. They spent hours lugging heavy boxes, cursing under their breath as they realized the full scope of Carl's hoarding habit. They eventually got to the car, but not before incurring a massive bill. I overheard one of the movers joking, "We should have brought a bulldozer." I never saw Margot or Todd that day. Guess they couldn't face me. That left me free to handle my next crisis, Karen's final attempt to break me. Because as soon as Margot's movers were gone, Karen escalated her campaign to an all-time high. It started with a new notice pinned to my door in bright neon paper titled, "Final Enforcement." Karen claimed I owed over $1,000 in accumulated fines, penalties for maintenance lapses, and administrative fees. She threatened to place a lien on my house if I didn't pay up. My blood boiled when I read it. A lien on my home? My father's living under this roof, dealing with heart issues. The last thing I need is a legal fight that jeopardizes our security. I called Lisa, who told me this was a common scare tactic. Sure enough, the next day I got a certified letter from the HOA's law firm. They repeated the same nonsense, either settle the fines or risk a lawsuit that could lead to foreclosure. For a moment, fear clenched at my gut. Then anger took over. I marched straight to Lisa's office. "They're threatening to take my home. Can they do that?" Lisa shook her head. "They can try, but we'll challenge every alleged violation. If they can't prove them, they have no grounds. I'll countersue for harassment if necessary. People like Karen assume homeowners will cave in under pressure. Don't give in. Let's take this to court." So I prepared to face them in small claims court, mentally bracing myself for a drawn-out war. But Karen, apparently not satisfied with legal avenues alone, made things personal. I started hearing rumors that she was spreading stories around the neighborhood, accusing me of having dangerous junk in my garage, posing some kind of chemical hazard. She told neighbors I was aggressive and unstable, that the police had been called multiple times, conveniently leaving out that it was she who summoned them. I'd never considered myself a vengeful guy, but her relentless lies made me want to expose her. Dad reminded me to stay calm, though. "Don't let her drag you into the mud," he'd say. So I followed Lisa's plan. We collected every letter, every notice, every snippet of conversation we had with Karen, building a rock-solid folder of evidence that Karen was abusing her position. Weeks passed in tense silence, until finally we received our court date. It was set for a Wednesday morning in a cramped local courthouse. I was nervous as hell, but Lisa's confidence kept me steady. We were about to see if Karen could actually back up her claims, or fold like a cheap lawn chair. The morning of the hearing, I arrived wearing my best collared shirt, still feeling underdressed, but it was the nicest thing I owned aside from a wedding suit that no longer fit. Lisa gave me a reassuring nod as we entered the courtroom. Karen was there, flanked by a lawyer I'd never seen before, a sleek man in a tailored suit. She wore her usual smug expression, refusing to look in my direction. Once proceedings began, the judge, a stern woman in her 60s, asked the HOA's attorney to present their case. He stood and delivered a polished spiel about how the HOA had the right to enforce compliance, that I'd repeatedly ignored deadlines, and that the community's welfare was at risk. Lisa calmly replied, flipping through her binder, "Your Honor, these are the cited bylaws." She pointed to a highlighted portion. Notice that none of them explicitly forbid having a legally parked vehicle in a privately enclosed space. Furthermore, none of them address so-called junk inside a closed garage. The judge raised an eyebrow at Karen. "Miss Karen, do you have any direct photographic evidence of these alleged violations being visible from the street or common areas?" Karen flushed. "Well, I do have photos." She fumbled with a folder and pulled out shots, but the angles were weird, like she'd stuck her phone in my windows. Lisa jumped on that. "Your Honor, these photos appear to be taken through the homeowner's private windows without permission. That in itself is a violation of Mr. Henderson's privacy. The HOA cannot trespass to collect evidence." The judge peered at the pictures. "Miss Karen, is there a reason you took these photos? They show an interior area not visible from public property. Karen sputtered, I was verifying the rumor that he had hazardous materials. Rumor? So there wasn't a formal complaint from the city or a safety inspection, the judge pressed. No, but, Lisa cut in, no official complaint, no official inspection, simply Miss Karen's personal interest. As for the alleged fines, they were levied without proper notice or the opportunity for Mr. Henderson to rectify any real documented violation. It's basically harassment. Karen's lawyer tried to regain control, but the judge held up a hand. I see no legitimate grounds for these fines. Miss Karen, an HOA can't conjure rules out of thin air, especially not to intrude on private property. Unless you have something else, I'm leaning toward dismissing these claims. For the first time, Karen looked shaken. But the community, it's about property values. The judge leveled a stare at her. Property values are not a basis for overstepping basic property rights. Case dismissed. It was over so quickly, I almost felt a wave of disbelief. Karen sat there, mouth agape, as Lisa packed up her paperwork. I caught Karen's eye for a second, and the hatred burning there was intense, but she'd lost. The judge had slammed the gavel, figuratively anyway, and that was the final word. We stepped outside, Lisa congratulating me. That's that. If Karen tries anything else, let me know. Relief washed over me, but I could still feel Karen's glare on my back. She was someone who always had to have the last word. I expected one final showdown before she slunk away. I was right. It was late, and the house was quiet except for the rustling of papers on my kitchen table. I was reviewing some bills, half distracted by the soft hum of the TV in the other room where Dad was dozing off. Then came the knock. Or rather, the pounding. Heavy, rapid fists hammering on the front door like someone was ready to break it down. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath, and rose to my feet. I already knew who it was. Karen. When I opened the door, there she stood, framed in the amber glow of the porch light, eyes blazing with fury. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and maybe she hadn't. Her blazer was wrinkled, hair disheveled, but her rage burned brighter than ever. You think you've won, don't you? She sneered, her voice sharp as a knife. With your fancy lawyer and your sob story father making me look like the bad guy. You've humiliated me, Travis. You've humiliated the entire HOA. And for what? A garage full of trash and a clunker car? I stepped out, shutting the door gently behind me, shielding Dad from the noise. Karen, it's done, I said calmly. Everyone sees through you now. You've got no more power over me or anyone else around here. She took a step forward, jabbing a finger in my chest. Don't you dare speak to me like that. Your house is a blight on this neighborhood, and your little buddy Carl's garbage heap is a ticking time bomb. You're turning this place into a scrapyard. She jabbed again. I'll see to it personally that you're evicted. That car's still sitting in your garage, and it's mine by law. You don't own that car, I snapped, finally brushing her hand away. And you sure as hell don't own me. Her eyes narrowed to slits. I've dealt with tougher men than you. I almost laughed. I seriously doubt that. Before she could fire back, headlights swept across the driveway. A beat-up truck pulled in behind my car, and out stepped Margot and Todd, Carl's kids. They were dressed rough, like they'd come straight from the scrapyard, sleeves rolled up and eyes full of purpose. Karen turned, confused. What are they doing here? Margot crossed her arms, voice ice cold. We're here to handle our father's things, officially, Todd chimed in, smirking. And to make sure this neighborhood queen stops harassing Travis. Karen looked from me to them, visibly shaken but masking it with arrogance. This doesn't concern you two. You're just here to collect your junk, then you'll be gone. Margot stepped closer. Actually, Karen, we just had a very enlightening chat with Travis here. She shot me a quick glance. We know how you've been treating him, and how you disrespected our father's memory. Karen scoffed. Your father left garbage behind, plain and simple, and Travis is enabling this nonsense. Todd's voice cut in sharp. You want the truth? Carl's garage hoard? It's worth something. Those parts are valuable to collectors, scrapyards, even machinists. You called it trash, but it's going to pay off a good chunk of our bills. Karen faltered. That's impossible. I grinned. You didn't bother to look past the surface, Karen. You just assumed it was all junk. Margot leaned in with a wicked smile. So no, Karen, we're not leaving anytime soon. In fact, Travis invited us to stick around while we finish clearing out the garage and keep an eye on you. Karen's mask cracked. You can't just move in. HOA rules. Todd barked out a laugh. We're not moving in. We're visiting. And HOA doesn't dictate who Travis has in his house. I saw Karen's hands trembling. She was unraveling. That's when Bob Jenkins and Sheila from across the street appeared on their front lawn, flashlights in hand. Is everything all right here? Bob called out. Karen spun around, forcing a fake smile. Just a little misunderstanding. But Sheila wasn't having it. Karen, it's the middle of the night. You're harassing Travis again? Bob nodded grimly. Looks like the whole block's watching now. Curtains twitched across the street. More porch lights clicked on. Karen was center stage in front of the entire neighborhood, her antics fully exposed. Margot folded her arms tighter. You've bullied this man long enough. Karen's facade crumbled. This isn't over, she hissed. You don't know who you're dealing with. Todd smirked. Oh, we know exactly who you are, and so does everyone else now. Karen turned on me one last time. Her voice trembled with rage and desperation. I will find a way to take you down, Travis. I stepped forward, close enough to meet her eye to eye. No, Karen, you won't. You've already lost.